It's really important to note that the acceleration program is not punitive in itself. The program is meant to just be a way to identify those problem areas and address them with resources and partnership, to bring the relevant agencies to the table and make sure that we're focusing on the work that needs to be focused on. However, there is an enforcement element to this work. If a city misses several critical deadlines or pushes past the good faith limitation, it can end up in enforcement territory. And part of the work of this group is to sort of identify possible enforcement measures. And that's delicate. They have to be, significant enough to have enough teeth to really incentivize good faith efforts. And we can think through together what those might look like. I'm going to emphasize that the hope is that these never are used. We never get to that point. They just provide a backstop that ensures that cities don't fall behind. I'm going to hand it off now to Sean to discuss some of the specifics of the statute. And then I think we have some time to dive into some of the questions as a group and talk about it a little bit more.
Yeah, and again, apologies to the RAC members if you feel like you're going through Groundhog's Day. But I know we talked about this 2 days ago. But just as a kind of, I guess, a reminder for the TAC folks who are new in this meeting, we kind of have broken this down into three kind of major questions. So the statute 197.293, it has a lot of details about like what this process looks like. What are the timelines? What are the principles that DLCD must adhere to in the development of this or the implementation of this particular statute? So a lot of these decisions are made, but there are some definite areas where we have to answer some pretty significant questions in order to make this statute work. And we've kind of broken it down into three parts. So I think Thea, she ran through the flow. I think the best way to think about it is that, we have these production targets, we have these quantifiable metrics that we're going to be tracking and evaluating at the statewide level. And they form this kind of barometer that's like, it's this quantifiable validation. DLCD has some direction to refer some local governments into kind of a deeper qualitative evaluation, kind of an audit. What's going on the ground? What are the barriers? Why are we not meeting our goals? And what can we do about it at the state and local levels, right? And the intent is to foster kind of a partnership, right, to ensure that we're taking actions. And it also prescribes deadlines depending on, the nature of what those barriers are, whether they're directly within a local government's control or whether they're outside of it. What are the contexts for the barriers that are happening on the ground? And then it results in kind of, this audit process results in an obligation, a requirement to take actions by a deadline, right? And the enforcement provision of it, the quote unquote teeth that I think Thea mentioned, is when we don't take actions that, in response to need by a prescribed deadline, right? And the bill prescribes these different kind of tools, enforcement tools and incentives to kind of ideally bring local governments back into compliance and, hopefully never happen in the first place, but they're intended to be there so that way there's this clear and communicable consequence. If we don't take action by this date, we can expect this to happen, right? And there's a few things that are outlined there, like model codes, that type of thing. So we kind of break it down into these three questions. The first, we have to figure out, and I think as many folks know, without the benefit of knowing exactly what OHCS's housing production dashboard and equity indicators looks like, what does this referral process look like? How do we structure it to make sure that we're casting a reasonably wide net and, evaluating a reasonable subset of jurisdictions? Then there's also the second question. We have this audit process where we identify the barriers. What does that look like? Who do we talk to? And how do we structure this to, make it kind of a collaborative effort where we identify these shared barriers at the state and local levels to production, right? And then, we have these kind of obligations that come out of them in terms of requirements to action, but that gets us into this third question. What if we don't take actions by a deadline? What are those tools that are going to be that backstop that are clear and communicable to local decision makers on, if we don't do X, this is what we can expect to happen, right? And how do we make sure and structure that in a way that always encourages every community to be pro-housing, right? And so those are kind of the three major questions that we've identified. Again, these are not just exhaustive. These are not the only things that we have to look at, but we've identified these, we have to answer these questions in order to fulfill and make the statute function, right? So there might be other areas where we might need to look at that have a nexus to housing accountability too. So I just want to throw that out there. But with that, I think I'll bounce it back over to, Deb and the discussion.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, Sean and Thea. Sean, could you stop sharing for a second and I'll pull up the Miro board? Thank you. So for those of you, if you came back a moment late from break, just to recap, in the chat is a link to a whiteboard for you all to provide some comments to the two key questions for our discussion around the Housing Accountability TAC charge and direction. And the questions are, what are the key outcomes needed to address the legislative direction for housing accountability? And then what are the policy tensions or challenges you see in achieving that? As you can see, we already have some sharing going on. I'm going to just take a pause for a second. Brock, I see your hand up. We're going to have a verbal discussion. I just know, thank you to RAC member who pointed out the other day, just the challenge of looking at the board, having a discussion. So let's just do a little time with the board. You can participate if you'd like, grab a sticky, pop it in there. And then we'll just take a couple of minutes of quiet time to do that. And then we'll come back and have a discussion. And you're welcome to leave your hand up, Brock, or anyone else. I'll come back and we'll start talking in a moment. Okay, it looks like more comments are coming in and we'll keep populating. And I should have stressed, even if you're not on the Housing Accountability TAC, we would very much like to hear your feedback on these questions. It's a really nice opportunity to see that integration and to have you sort of think about that and absorb that. And I was also terribly remiss in pointing out the sort of sub questions that are on here are really getting a little bit toward that equity framework that we talked about earlier, really thinking about legislative direction and outcomes needed, especially how that might affect different populations, who might be positively or negatively impacted, how underserved and underhoused communities could be positively or negatively impacted in both cases. Okay, so I'm going to open it up for discussion. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and we'll come back to this just before we move on to the next topic. But Brock, what's on your mind?
Just one short question, one more technical one. If we're avoiding the board, can we submit like a comment letter style piece? And then what's the deadline to do that?
Ethan or Sean, do you all have thoughts about that? We haven't sorted that out, Brock.
Okay.
We do, yeah. So we'll have a very